Spring 1943. A bare ridge of rock in the Tunisian desert. An American general stands alone, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the shimmering horizon for one man. He has waited his entire life for what's coming. Out there, somewhere in the heat haze, is the most dangerous soldier in the German army, the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel. George Patton means to find him, fight him, and beat him. There's only one problem. Rommel isn't out there. The man Patton is hunting is already 1,000 miles away, sick, beaten, and finished. What beat him wasn't a general at all. It wasn't a better tank, or a bolder plan, or a braver army. It was an empty fuel tank and a cargo ship lying on the bottom of the Mediterranean. This is the story of the greatest duel the Second World War never saw. Two of the finest commanders who ever lived. Destined, everyone believed, to settle the war between them. They would never once meet, because the desert had already chosen its winner, and it wasn't either of them. To see how good these two men really were, and how cruel their endings, we have to go back to the start. May 1940, the forests of northern France. A German tank column is moving so fast it has outrun its own maps. At its head, standing upright in the turret, is a wiry officer who refuses to wait for orders. He drives his division deeper and deeper behind enemy lines, faster than anyone thought tanks could go. His own high command loses track of where he is, and whole French units surrender to a force they never saw coming. His men start calling it the Ghost Division. The officer's name is Erwin Rommel. He was an unlikely man to be making history 20 years earlier. Few would have picked him for a soldier at all. Erwin Rommel was born in 1891 in a quiet town in southern Germany, the son of a schoolteacher, middle class, with no military blood, no Nobelwohn, no family estate. As a boy, he was dreamy and technically minded. At 14, he and a friend built a full-size glider that actually flew. He might have become an engineer. Instead, he put on a uniform. Then came the trenches of the First World War, where that quiet young man discovered what he was born to do. In October 1917, high in the mountains of the Italian front, Lieutenant Rommel led a small detachment on a daring climb behind enemy lines, moving fast and striking where no one expected. He and a few hundred men took an entire mountain and captured roughly 9,000 enemy troops in barely 3 days. For that, at just 26, he was given the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest award for courage, a medal almost always reserved for generals. The schoolmaster's son had learned the lesson that would define his life. The bold move beats the safe one. Every single time, a year before, he'd married a young woman named Lucy. Remember her? She will matter. Terribly. At the very end, there was one man in Germany, though, who loved that kind of soldier. Adolf Hitler took the self-made officer under his wing and pulled him upward fast. Rommel, for his part, was glad to be the regime's shining hero. He brought cameramen to the front and reshot his own scenes until he looked heroic enough. The Desert Fox was, in part, a carefully built illusion. But remember this bargain. The man who made Rommel a god would one day order him to die. In February 1941, Rommel and his tanks landed in North Africa. He'd been sent to save Germany's Italian allies, who were being chased across Libya in headlong retreat. His orders were cautious. Hold the line. Wait. Rommel read them, and did the opposite. The open desert was the perfect arena for the only kind of war he knew. No towns, no rivers, no front lines. Just a vast empty board where armies moved like fleets at sea. Rommel raced across it like a pirate, vanishing into the dust and reappearing behind his enemies. The British couldn't catch him. They couldn't even predict him. They started calling him the Desert Fox, half in fear, half in awe. The desert, though, would also teach him his first hard lesson, one he refused to learn. When Rommel first landed in Africa in early 1941, his orders were strictly defensive. Hold the line and wait for supplies. He tore the orders up. In late March, he sent 3 columns of tanks storming east across the Libyan desert. The British, caught completely off guard, broke and ran hundreds of miles, all the way back toward Egypt. Rommel's men even captured 2 British generals in the chaos. One British commander told his officers, grimly, that there was now nothing left between the Desert Fox and Cairo. One thing did stand in his way, though a battered little port on the coast called Tobruk. Inside it, dug into caves and trenches, was a garrison of Australians who simply refused to leave. Rommel threw attack after attack at them. Everyone was thrown back. Nazi radio sneered that the defenders were trapped like rats. So the Australians proudly named themselves the Rats of Tobruk. They would hold that little port against the Desert Fox for more than 200 days. For the first time in the entire war, German tanks had been stopped cold. Yet while Rommel was stuck outside those walls, his own great weakness was catching up with him. Late in 1941, the British struck back with a massive offensive and finally broke through to relieve Tobruk. Rommel's tanks were worn out, and his supplies had run down to almost nothing. He had no choice but to retreat, giving back, in a matter of weeks, nearly everything he had taken. It was a warning written in the sand. The desert rewarded boldness, but it destroyed any army that outran its own supply. Rommel didn't listen. Early in 1942, he counterattacked yet again and drove the British right back to a line in the sand called Gazala. By the spring of 1942, the British thought they finally had him cornered. They dug in behind the Gazala line more than 50 miles of minefields, strongpoints, and barbed wire west of the port of Tobruk. They had more men than Rommel, more tanks, more guns. By every rule of war, an attacker needs to outnumber a dug-in enemy 3-1. Rommel had less than even. He attacked anyway. What followed was his masterpiece. He sent his Italian troops straight at the British front as a feint loud and obvious, dragging the enemy's eyes north. To sell the lie, he had trucks drag brushwood across the sand, throwing up huge clouds of dust to fake a massive assault. While the British stared at the dust, Rommel swung his entire panzer force south, around their open flank, and came up behind them. It should have been a death blow. Yet Rommel had driven so deep, so fast, that he trapped himself, pinned against the British minefields, surrounded, his tanks running dry of fuel and water. The Desert Fox was suddenly the one facing destruction. For a day and a night, even Rommel believed it was over. He came close to surrendering. Then he clawed a single supply route open through the mines, and everything changed. From a pocket the British nicknamed the Cauldron, he turned and tore their counterattacks to pieces. He had snatched victory out of his own near defeat and handed the British the worst beating of their war. Days later, the fortress of Tobruk fell, and more than 30,000 men marched into captivity. The next morning, Hitler made him a field marshal at 50, one of the youngest in the German army. Rommel drove east in triumph, all the way to the gates of Egypt, 60 miles from Alexandria, with the Suez Canal almost within reach. At that moment, the Desert Fox must have felt unbeatable. Far behind the Desert Fox, though out of sight of the cameras, a quieter war was being lost. Picture a single German tank, deep in the Egyptian desert. Its crew has been fighting for days. The enemy is close, and the needle on the fuel gauge is sitting on empty. The engine coughs once and dies. There's no fuel to move it, because the ship that was carrying it is lying at the bottom of the sea. The crew can't advance. They can't retreat. They can only wait to be killed or captured. This was happening again and again, all across Rommel's army. Every mile he'd advanced toward Egypt had stretched his lifeline thinner. His tanks, his guns, his men, all of it ran on fuel and food that had to cross the Mediterranean by ship, and that sea was a killing ground. At the very center of it sat a tiny British island called Malta. From Malta's airfields and harbors, British planes and submarines hunted Rommel's supply convoys and sent them to the bottom, one after another. The Germans bombed that island so relentlessly it became the most heavily bombed place on the entire planet. Malta would not die, though, and it would not stop sinking his ships. Worse still for Rommel, British codebreakers had begun cracking Germany's secret messages. Time and again, they knew exactly which tanker was sailing, and exactly where to sink it. Rommel would plan a grand attack and then watch the fuel he needed for it slide beneath the waves. Rommel could win every battle in the desert, and still lose the war on the seabed. He was a magician on the battlefield, and a child at the one thing that wins long war supply. The greatest tactician of his generation was being strangled by arithmetic he couldn't outfight. In the autumn of 1942, the arithmetic finally came to collect at a dusty railway halt in Egypt called El Alamein. By now, even Rommel's body was failing him, sick and worn down. He'd been sent back to Germany to recover. Across the wire, a careful British general named Bernard Montgomery had built up everything the Desert Fox lacked. 1,000 tanks, 900 guns, and above all, an endless river of fuel. Knowing he could no longer win a war of movement, Rommel turned the desert itself into a trap. His men buried 500,000 mines and belts miles deep, a nightmare of steel and explosives they called the Devil's Gardens. On the night of October 23rd, 1942, Montgomery opened the battle with a wall of artillery. Nearly 1,000 guns fired at once, a barrage so vast it was heard 60 miles away. in the streets of Alexandria. Then, under that fire, British infantry crept forward on foot to clear paths through the mines, one deadly step at a time. In the chaos of the first day, the German officer left in charge drove toward the front, suffered a heart attack, and died. Rommel, still sick, threw himself onto a plane and raced back to Africa. What he found was a nightmare. His army was being ground to pieces. His men were down to half rations, and he had fuel for perhaps 3 days of fighting. For 12 days, the two armies tore at each other in the sand, in a brutal, grinding slaughter. When Rommel reached for his panzers to strike back, he often found them frozen in place, their tanks bone dry. Slowly, inevitably, the side with more of everything began to win, down to just a few dozen working tanks. Rommel knew the battle was lost and began pulling his men back to save them. Then a message arrived from Hitler. Victory or death. No retreat. Stand and die where you are! For a moment, the loyal soldier obeyed. Then Rommel did something he had never done. He defied his Führer and ordered the retreat anyway. He would not throw away the lives of his men for the pride of a man safe in a bunker 1,000 miles away. The Desert Fox had been beaten at last, not outfought, but starved. Here was a man no enemy general could outwit, beaten by an empty fuel tank. What followed was the longest retreat of his life, more than 1,000 miles west, his shrinking army limping toward Tunisia. By the spring of 1943, the Desert Fox was a sick and exhausted man, his face yellowed by jaundice, his army a wreck. He threw one last desperate attack, and it failed, and somewhere to the west, stepping off a ship onto that same desert, a new enemy was arriving to hunt him, an American who dreamed of this fight since he was a boy. The two of them had waited their whole lives for this duel, and history was about to play its cruelest trick of all. George Patton believed he had lived before, not as a figure of speech he meant it. Completely, he was convinced his soul had marched with ancient armies, that he'd fought and bled and died on battlefields across thousands of years. War, to Patton, wasn't a career. It was the reason his soul kept returning to Earth. Yet the boy who'd become America's fiercest warrior had the unlikeliest of starts. Born in 1885 into California wealth, young George couldn't read. The letter swam on the page, and he didn't learn to read until he was nearly 12. At school, the other children laughed at him. I am stupid. He wrote of himself as a boy, yet he had a ferocious memory, and a father who read him tales of ancient heroes for hours on end. Slowly, though, the boy who couldn't read willed himself into a soldier. He fought his way through West Point, forced to repeat an entire year after failing his studies. He turned himself into an Olympic athlete, competing for the United States in 1912. He chased the outlaw Pancho Villa across Mexico in the U.S. Army's first ever motorized raid in the First World War, leading tanks forward on foot through German fire. He was shot down and nearly killed. The boy who couldn't read a book had become a man who quoted history, wrote poetry, and hungered for glory above all else. He wore a pair of ivory-handled pistols, and if you dared call them pearl-handled, he'd snarl that only a cheap bordello pimp would carry pearl. He read the Bible every single night and cursed like a sailor every single day. For years, one idea burned at the center of all of it. Somewhere across the world was a German who might be his equal, the Desert Fox. Patton studied him like Scripture read his book on tactics, traced his campaigns, learned the way the man thought. In Patton's mind, the whole war would come down to one thing, the day the two of them finally met. Tank against tank. He wanted that duel more than he wanted to live. So while Rommel was carving his legend across the sands of Africa, Patton was waiting, burning with impatience. In 1942, the U.S. Army handed him a stretch of blistering California desert and told him to forge an army for the coming fight. He drove his tank crews through the heat like a man possessed, hardening them for the very desert where his rival reigned. Every report of the Desert Fox's victories only sharpened his hunger to face the man himself. His chance came in November 1942. In one of the most audacious gambles of the war, an armada of 100 American ships slipped out of Virginia and crossed 3,000 miles of ocean in total secrecy, through waters swarming with German submarines. Their target was the coast of French Morocco, and no one knew whether the French there would welcome them or open fire. They opened fire off Casablanca. French warships and shore guns dueled the American fleet in the largest naval battle ever fought in the Atlantic Ocean. Patton was so eager to get ashore that when his own cruiser's giant guns fired, the blast blew the bottom clean out of the landing boat waiting to carry him in. For 3 days, his men fought their way through the surf and the shell fire. Then the French laid down their arms and Patton marched into Casablanca on his own 57th birthday. Ever the showman? He received the beaten French commanders with champagne and a guard of honor, saying there was no use kicking a man when he's down. At last, he had his foothold in North Africa. The real fight, though, was hundreds of miles east, in Tunisia, and the young American army marched into it badly. In February 1943, at a mountain pass called Kasserine, that army met the Germans for the first time. It was a slaughter. The Germans came at them out of the winter murk with waves of tanks and screaming dive bombers. These green Americans had never seen anything like it, and they had no answer. The Afrika Korps tore through them like paper. Tanks burned. Whole units broke and ran. Terrified men threw down their weapons and streamed to the rear, some not stopping for 50 miles. Around 6,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of days. And the man who'd commanded that German attack was Rommel himself. The Desert Fox had bloodied the Americans on their very first day in the ring. Germany's veterans came away sneering that these soft, green Americans would never be able to fight. It was a national humiliation. The Allied commander, Dwight Eisenhower, needed a man who could rebuild a broken army in days, not months. He sent for Patton. On the 6th of March, 1943, Patton took command of the shattered corps and hit it like a storm. He stormed through camps at dawn, roaring at half-dressed soldiers, demanding clean uniforms, sharp salutes, iron discipline. It looked like pettiness. It was something else. He was pouring backbone back into men who had lost it. In a matter of weeks, a beaten rabble started to feel, once more, like an army. All the while, one thought drove him forward. Rommel was out there. The duel was finally coming, but Patton was chasing a ghost. On the 9th of March, just 3 days after Patton took command, Rommel boarded a plane, sick and defeated, and left Africa for the last time. He'd been beaten already, not by Patton, but by the empty fuel tanks and the ships on the seabed. And here's the cruelest part. Patton didn't know. Every American soldier marching east still believed they were closing in on the legendary Desert Fox. On the 23rd of March, near a sun-baked oasis called El Guitar, the blow finally landed. At dawn, German tanks rolled out of a mountain pass, straight at the dug-in Americans. The Germans expected another Kasserine, another easy rout of frightened boys. This time, the boys didn't run. Patton had drilled them, hardened them, and dug them into the high ground with their guns ready. The German tanks rumbled into a minefield, and as they slowed and bunched together, American artillery and tank destroyers opened up and tore them apart. Within hours, dozens of panzers were burning on the valley floor, and the survivors turned and pulled back. For the first time in the war, American soldiers had beaten a veteran German armored force in open battle. The Green Boys of Kasserine had grown teeth. It was Patton's victory, the one he'd hungered for his whole life. And then he learned the truth. The tanks he'd just beaten at El Guitar weren't Rommel's by then. The Desert Fox had been gone for 2 weeks. The man Patton had finally beaten was a stranger he'd never even heard of. Decades later, a famous movie would hand Patton a swaggering line shouting to Rommel that he'd read his book and was ready to beat him. But it was pure Hollywood. Patton never got to say those words to the Desert Fox because the Desert Fox was never there. The duel he'd been born for had slipped through his fingers without ever happening. But Patton's war was far from over. What came next would prove he was every bit the equal of the man he never got to fight. That summer, he led the 7th Army ashore on Sicily, in what was then the largest amphibious invasion the world had ever seen. The plan, though handed the glory to the British, Patton was ordered simply to guard Montgomery's flank while the British drove for the prize. For a man who believed he was born for greatness, playing bodyguard was unbearable. So Patton simply cut his army loose. He drove it in a lightning dash clear across the island and seized the capital, Palermo, before anyone could stop him. Then he wheeled east and turned the campaign into a personal race against Montgomery for the port of Messina. He even threw troops ashore in daring leaps along the coast to get there first. He won. His men marched into Messina just hours ahead of the British. It was pure Patton. Fast, aggressive, brilliant, and just a little out of control. Yet that same reckless fire nearly destroyed him. Visiting the wounded in Sicily's field hospitals, Patton came upon 2 soldiers with no visible injuries, men, broken not in body, but in mind by the sheer terror of combat. To Patton, there was no such thing. He saw only cowards. He slapped them, cursed them, and ordered them back to the front. When the story got out, it exploded into a scandal that nearly ended his career and forced him to stand before whole divisions of men and apologize. For the great invasion of France, the Allies left their most aggressive general on the bench and used his name as a decoy to fool the Germans. But they couldn't keep him there for long. In the summer of 1944, Patton took command of the Third Army in France, and finally, the leash came off. What followed was one of the fastest, most ferocious armored advances in the history of war. His tanks burst out of Normandy and simply refused to stop. They tore across France, liberating town after town, covering in days what other armies took months to win. Patton drove his men to the edge of exhaustion, always forward, always attacking, never giving the enemy a moment to breathe. The Germans, who had once feared Rommel's speed, now learned to fear the Americans. Town after town fell, and the enemy simply couldn't run fast enough to escape him. And then, at the very height of the charge, Patton's tanks rolled to a stop. Not stopped by the enemy, stopped by empty fuel tanks. His army's gasoline had been sent north to another front. The greatest attacker, the U.S. Army, had halted by the very same thing that doomed Rommel in the desert, an empty fuel tank. But Patton saved his finest hour for last. In December 1944, deep in a brutal winter, Hitler threw 250,000 men into one last desperate gamble through the forests of the Ardennes. This surprise attack tore a huge bulge in the American line and surrounded a division of paratroopers at a vital crossroads town called Bastogne. The men trapped inside were freezing, starving, and almost out of ammunition. When the Germans demanded their surrender, the American commander sent back a single word: nuts. But defiance alone couldn't save them. They needed rescue, and fast, and everyone knew it would take a miracle. At an emergency meeting of the Allied commanders, someone asked how soon anyone could counterattack. They expected the answer to be weeks. Patton told them he could attack in 2 days. The room went silent. The other generals thought it was impossible, even insane. What they didn't know was that Patton had seen the blow coming and had already secretly set his army in motion. In the dead of winter, he wheeled an entire army 90 degrees, 100,000 men and their machines, turning north through blizzards and frozen roads. Military experts still call it one of the most stunning feats of command in the history of war. There was one enemy, though even Patton couldn't order into submission: the weather. Thick cloud and fog had grounded his airplanes, and without them his men were fighting half blind. So Patton, the profane old warrior, ordered his chaplain to write a prayer begging God for clear skies to destroy the enemy. On December 23rd, the skies broke open, and the Allied planes swept down on the German columns like hawks. And on the 26th of December, Patton's lead tanks finally smashed through to the trapped men of Bastogne. It was the finest operation of his career and one of the greatest feats of generalship of the entire war. By the end, George Patton was one of the most feared commanders on earth, proof, beyond any doubt, that he belonged in the same breath as the Desert Fox. And that is what makes the ending so cruel. The two finest tank generals of the war, both at the peak of their powers, were never once allowed to face each other. Rommel had been cut down in France, wounded by an air attack, before Patton's tanks ever broke loose. The duel the whole world imagined would live nowhere but in their dreams. So how do you judge two men who never fought? Start with raw instinct, the gift for reading a battle as it breathes and shifts. Here, honestly, Rommel stands almost alone. At Gazala, he beat a bigger, dug-in army. From a near hopeless position, the kind of victory most generals only dream of, on pure battlefield instinct. The Fox wins, but battles are not wars. And wars are won by the thing Rommel was worst at: feeding the machine, again and again. He drove deeper than his supplies could follow, and his men paid for it in blood and thirst. Patton, for all his theater, never forgot a hard truth: an army crawls forward on its fuel and its stomach, when it counted most. At Bastogne, he moved an entire army across a frozen battlefield in days, a feat of planning Rommel never matched. On the unglamorous business of winning wars, Patton takes it. Then there's leadership, the power to look beaten men in the eye and make them fight again. Rommel led from the front, and even his enemies admired him. Patton took a humiliated army and gave it back its spine in 3 weeks. Call that one even? Yet none of those rounds is the one that actually decided the desert. The winner wasn't the better tactician, or the bolder attacker, or the harder leader. It was the side that could put fuel in the tank and bread in the hand and keep it coming. Behind Patton stood the bottomless industrial might of America. Oceans of tanks, trucks, fuel, and ships. Behind Rommel stood a single thin thread across a hostile sea, and it was being cut, ship by ship. Rommel was a great man fighting a war his country had already lost the means to win. That's the lesson the legends never tell you. In modern war, Genius is not enough. The army that can't feed its tanks will lose no matter whose hands are on the wheel. Two of the finest soldiers who ever lived, and their war was decided by something as small and as merciless as an empty fuel tank. But forget the generals for a moment. Go back to that single tank, stranded in the Egyptian desert with a dry fuel line and a dead engine. There were thousands of crews like it, young men who'd followed the Desert Fox to the edge of Egypt, only to be left with no fuel, no water, and no way home. Go back to the American boys at Kasserine, thrown into their first battle and cut down before they understood what was happening. When it was finally over, in May of 1943, more than 250,000 Axis soldiers laid down their arms. 250,000 men gone in a single collapse. That was the real arithmetic of the Desert War, not the duel, the dead. And the two legends. The desert's cruelty followed them both to the grave. Remember the bargain Rommel made at the start? The man who'd built him into a god. By 1944, the Desert Fox had seen enough of the madness to quietly turn against the Führer he'd once admired. When a group of officers tried to kill Hitler with a bomb, Rommel's name was found among those they'd hoped to bring into a new Germany. It didn't seem to matter that he'd taken no part in the plot itself. On the 14th of October, 1944, two of Hitler's generals arrived at Rommel's home with an ultimatum. He could face a public trial that would drag his wife and son down with him, or he could swallow poison and be remembered as a hero. Rommel said goodbye to Lucy, the young woman he'd married nearly 30 years before, and to his son. Then he climbed into the back of a car, was driven a short way down a quiet road, and took the cyanide to the world. The regime hid the truth and buried the Desert Fox with full military honors, a fallen hero of the Reich. The greatest soldier Germany produced was destroyed, in the end, by the very man who'd made him. And here is the final twist in the legend of the Desert Fox. After the war, the West chose to remember Rommel as the good German, the clean, chivalrous knight who never truly believed in Hitler. It was a comforting story, and in the tense years that followed, a convenient one, as a rearming West Germany was welcomed as an ally. The real Rommel, though, is harder to pin down. He owed his entire rise to Hitler's favor and served the regime's propaganda machine with a smile. He was neither the spotless hero of the movies nor a simple monster, but something far more human and far more troubling. Even the greatest legend of the Desert War was, in the end, half myth and Patton. After Bastogne, he drove his Third Army deep into Germany, storming across the Rhine in the spring of 1945. There, his men threw open the gates of a place that would haunt him for the rest of his days. It was a Nazi concentration camp, the first the Western Allies had ever seen, filled with the starved and the murdered. Patton had lived through 30 years of war and thought nothing on earth could turn his stomach. At that camp, the hardest warrior in the American army walked to the side of a building and was violently sick. He could not force himself to enter one shed, where the bodies were stacked like firewood. A few weeks later, the war in Europe was over. Peace, for a man like Patton, was almost unbearable. Restless and out of place, he was soon stripped of the beloved Third Army he had led across a continent. He had won everything. A soldier could win everything but the one duel he'd been born for. Then, that December, the warrior who'd survived a lifetime of battle was riding in the back of his car when it struck an army truck at a crossroads. No one else was badly hurt, but Patton's neck was broken, and he lay paralyzed. 12 days later, he died quietly in a hospital bed. No bullet, no glory, no last great battle. Almost at once, the whispers began. A general famous for loudly hating the Soviets, killed in a strange, low-speed crash. Just as the war ended, some were certain he'd been murdered. The conspiracy theories have never fully died, but every official investigation reached the same quiet conclusion. It was an accident, at his wife's request. They buried him not beneath some grand monument, but out among the plain white crosses of his own soldiers, the men of the Third Army who fell at Bastogne. Two extraordinary men, chasing each other across history, and never once allowed to meet. Which brings us back to that ridge in the Tunisian desert. To an American general, alone with his binoculars, scanning the horizon for a ghost who was already gone. The duel he searched for would live in only one place, his own imagination. So we're left with the question history never got to answer. Who was the better General Rommel? Or Patton, the fox who could win any battle, but couldn't win the war? Or the warrior who mastered the machine of modern war, but never got to face his greatest rival? The desert never gave us the answer. So now I'm asking you, if these two had ever truly met mind against mind, tank against tank, who would have walked away? Tell me below. I'll be reading everyone. Thanks for staying until the end. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Your support is incredibly valuable to us and helps this channel grow.